Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the CFP rankings. Not a ton of changes happened this past weekend. Whole lot of favorites won, so it wasn't a big deal this past weekend, but it's going to get wild. I feel it coming this weekend. I think there's going to be quite a bit of chaos and some hard decisions to make on that selection Sunday. We'll talk about it more next week, but for the time being, we got to focus on conference championships. It is the final week of the regular season, which means someone's going to punch their ticket. A lot of people are going to be left behind for those conference championship games. And how much does it mean in each conference is a big time question mark for me. We'll start with probably the most important of the bunch, the ACC. It's a weird conference. There are 6 teams here. Yeah, 6 teams that are still firmly alive to be in the thing. As crazy as that sounds, that is very much on the table. I want to make something clear from the jump here. These are the cleanest paths for these teams. These are not the only paths. There are so many variables in the ACC. There could be a Boston College Syracuse game that could affect who gets to the ACC Championship if enough things happen. We're going to make this as simple as possible because I like to think we won't get all of the chaos in the world and it won't come down to a 1-10 versus 3-8 game to decide who has a better conference win percentage. It's very confusing over there in the ACC. These are the cleanest path forward for all of these teams. We'll start with Virginia and SMU. It's as simple as this: you win and you're in. You win this weekend, no problem. You are in the championship. If they both win, takes care of business. Virginia beats Virginia Tech, SMU beats Cal, and we have that matchup. No problem. Nothing more to say about that. That would be the cleanest way forward for the ACC. Then you have everything else. If Pitt were to beat Miami, they just need one of those teams to lose. They need either Virginia Tech to get a win over Virginia or Cal to get a win over SMU. And then you got Pitt sitting there in the ACC Championship with a chance to go to the CFP, something I wouldn't have bet on early in the season for the Panthers. But at the end of the day, they are just a win and one loss between those two teams away from doing it. Georgia Tech does not play an ACC game this weekend. They get Georgia, obviously, in Mercedes-Benz. They need all of these teams to lose. They need Virginia, SMU, and Pitt to lose. Then they would get another shot at the Panthers in that championship game. We'll see what would happen in that football game. There is still a lot that needs to happen for Georgia Tech. I wouldn't hold your breath. There's still a couple other options for what could happen if Georgia Tech was to get in. It's going to be really hard for Georgia Tech to get in if these 3 teams don't lose. So we'll keep it at that for the time being. That's the cleanest way for Georgia Tech to find their way there. Miami can still find their way to Charlotte at the end of this. They got to beat Pitt. They got to get losses from Virginia and SMU. Simple as that. They got to find a way to do those things. Then I believe they would play Pitt. If I'm not mistaken, I believe they would get Pitt in that game. Or, excuse me. They would likely get Pitt again in that football game. Maybe they would get Duke. There's a lot of scenarios when that happens that could kind of open up the floodgates of chaos. And then Duke is still in this thing. As crazy as that sounds, Duke is still alive for this thing. That have to beat Wake Forest, which they're very likely to do. And then Virginia or SMU has to lose. And Pitt just has to lose. Period. End of story. You have to get one of the top 2 to fall down, and then you got to get Pitt to fall down, and then I think you would play Miami, or you'd play the one of Virginia or SMU that didn't lose. Again, it's very complicated. This is by far the most complicated conference. If Virginia and SMU win, all of that is moot. That's going to be the 2 teams that are in that ACC championship. They will be battling for that ACC spot, at least one of the ACC spots, possibly. For Miami, you're probably going to need an at-large bid. That's your cleanest way forward. I'm not sure you're going to get it, and we'll talk about that next week. But cleanest path forward, Virginia, SMU win. If one of them loses, then you got to watch for Pitt to win that Miami game, and then we got a little bit of chaos if that doesn't happen. The Big 12, rather straightforward for this one. We got 4 teams that are still alive for this thing, and Utah is barely alive for this thing. But Texas Tech and BYU, they win their game this weekend. They're in. Frankly, Texas Tech is a major favorite over West Virginia. BYU, same exact thing with UCF. I think both those teams are going to win. I think those will be the teams that you will see in Arlington, and BYU's probably got to hope for a little bit more losses in front and behind them. But again, something we can talk about next week. But that's the cleanest way forward. I tend to believe that's what we're going to get. Now, Arizona State could very well do it if they beat Arizona and they get one loss from Texas Tech or BYU. Obviously, having that tiebreaker over Texas Tech gives them a massive benefit. You get that massive win, you could jump over Texas Tech, and then the Red Raiders would probably be on the outside looking in of the playoff just like that. As crazy as that sounds, if Arizona State wins, they lose to West Virginia, and BYU wins, it's BYU and Arizona State facing off in Arlington, and then you got to figure out where you stand after that. It's going to be really, really interesting to watch that unfold, but definitely something to watch there. And then Utah has a shot to get back into this thing. They got to beat Kansas. They got to get a loss from Texas Tech, and Arizona State has to win their game. I don't know why. That has to happen for Utah to find their way into this thing. Arizona State has to win. Texas Tech has to lose, and they got to beat Kansas. And then I think they'd get another shot at the Cougars. Be really cool to see the Holy War in the Big 12 Championship. There's no doubt about that. I'd be shocked if we got that. I think we're going to get those two top teams. I think Texas Tech's going to beat West Virginia. I think BYU is going to beat UCF. And we're going to have those two teams facing off in Arlington, the two best teams in the conference. Got no problem with that. And if we get a little bit of chaos, love Arizona State, love Utah. So would be fun regardless, but I don't think we're going to get a lot of chaos here. Moving over to the Big Ten, this is where we could get a little bit of chaos, depending on how you feel about the game coming up this weekend between Ohio State and Michigan. But again, Ohio State and Indiana, you win this weekend, you're going to be in. Spoiler alert, Indiana's going to win this weekend. They're playing Purdue. They're going to win the football game. They're going to win. They're going to be in Indianapolis. So it kind of takes out some of these scenarios that could be a reality here. But at the end of the day, Ohio State, you beat Michigan, you're in. Indiana, you beat Purdue, you're in. And the collision course is complete. You have Indiana and Ohio State, the two top teams in the country, facing off in Indianapolis. This is where it gets a little bit weird. If Michigan is able to beat Ohio State for the fifth year in a row, which wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world, of course, then you would have Oregon or Indiana would have to lose for Michigan to be in the dance. It wouldn't be as clean as them just beating Ohio State and getting in. They need Oregon to lose. Oregon would have the tiebreaker over Michigan in this scenario, so they would need Oregon to lose, or they would need Indiana to fall out of this thing. And then I think you could get a rematch. If both those teams lose, we could get the game once again in Indianapolis. Selfishly, that's kind of what I'm hoping for. But at the end of the day, we'll see what happens there. If Ohio State wins, doesn't matter for Michigan. For Oregon, if they beat Washington, then they need an Ohio State loss. They can't have an Indiana loss because Indiana has the tiebreaker over them. Wouldn't really change too much. It would still be Indiana, Ohio State, if Ohio State obviously beat Michigan. But if Oregon beats Washington, Michigan is able to beat Ohio State, then you have Oregon against Indiana, or hypothetically, you could have an Oregon against Michigan if both lose. I think you would still have Oregon against Indiana. So I don't think this one's going to get too chaotic. Obviously, Michigan's the big variable here. If Michigan wins, then it comes down to Oregon's result. If Oregon wins, then they would play Indiana. If Oregon loses, then Michigan would play Indiana in that championship game. I think Indiana's going to beat Purdue. So I don't think we have to worry about that reality too much, but Ohio State losing to Michigan is all too familiar at this point. So that is a real reality, and then we see if the Ducks or the Wolverines would take that spot in Indianapolis. And then the SEC, relatively straightforward here as well. We know Texas A&M, Alabama, they control their own destiny, especially with Alabama's win over Georgia. They win this weekend. A&M beats Texas. Alabama beats Auburn. They will meet in Atlanta. Simple as that. Those two teams will play. We'll talk about the implications of a 10-3 Alabama later on, but at the end of the day, that would be as simple as it can be. For Georgia, they just need one of those teams to lose. Either Alabama or Texas A&M to lose, they're in good shape because they don't play an SEC game. They get Georgia Tech, obviously, so not a problem. If one of those teams loses, they will be in Atlanta for a lot of years in a row. I don't remember if it's 6 or 7. It's a whole lot of years in a row that Georgia's been over there in Atlanta. I think this is a year where you could very well get one of those games lost. We'll talk about those games a little bit later, but at the end of the day, they just need one of those two teams to fall, and they will be in Atlanta playing the other one that doesn't fall hypothetically. Ole Miss can still get into this thing. If Mississippi State, if they beat Mississippi State, I should say, and then Bama and Texas A&M both lose, Then they could play Georgia in the championship game. That would be a matchup that we've already seen this year. Ole Miss would be able to get a little bit of revenge. You got to beat Mississippi State first. So we'll see how that unfolds. Obviously, Texas A&M could beat Texas and kind of ruin the fun for Ole Miss if they were to win earlier in the day. But at the end of the day, cleanest way forward, A&M and Alabama win. They play in Atlanta. Georgia's still firmly in this thing. If one of those teams loses, if both of them lose, you're getting Georgia and Ole Miss in Atlanta. And I don't think a lot of people are betting on that right this second. And then the group of five, relatively straightforward for a lot of these. Tulane, North Texas. If you win in the American, you will face off in that championship game. Both very heavy favorites this weekend, so tend to believe that's going to be the case. Navy still has a shot if one of those teams loses and they're able to beat Memphis, a game that they're not favored in. So I tend to believe we're going to see Tulane versus North Texas. Is that for a spot in the CFP? We'll find out throughout this week and when those next rankings come out, really. For the MAC, Western Michigan, Miami of Ohio, you win and you're in. You would be facing off Ohio, Toledo, and Central Michigan are still in this thing. It could get very chaotic up there in the MAC the way that it always does. But at the end of the day, if Western Michigan wins, if Miami of Ohio win, they're going to be facing off in the end of this thing. And then Mountain West, San Diego State, Boise State, winning in. That would be the matchup if those two teams win. UNLV will be next up. If New Mexico beats San Diego State, chaotic. I really don't know what the rankings would be at the end of it all. I know all of them would be in the conversation. All four of those teams would be right there, tied at the top. I don't know how all that would shake out. That's something that we'd have to watch for if New Mexico is able to knock off San Diego State. Then the Sun Belt, JMU, you're locked into the title, no big deal. That's still one of the division-type conferences, so JMU locked into their title game. They'll play the winner of Southern Miss Troy. The top two teams on the other side of the conference are facing off this weekend, so makes it rather easy. Southern Miss Troy, the winner of that one, will take on JMU. JMU's probably got to win this weekend, though, to keep themselves at least alive for the CFP. And then for the Conference USA, Missouri State's ineligible for this one because of dumb FBS rules. But at the end of the day, if Western Kentucky is able to beat Jacksonville State this weekend, we'll get a rematch next week in that conference championship game over there in the Conference USA. If it goes the other way and Jacksonville State is able to beat Western Kentucky this weekend, it'll be Jacksonville State against Kennesaw State, which has done a great job under Jerry Mack in their first year. That would be a very, very fun game to watch. But we could just get Western Kentucky against Jacksonville State in back-to-back weeks. If WKU is able to pull that one out, something to watch as we get down the stretch. Really, most of these are pretty chalk. The Mountain West could get very weird if New Mexico is able to knock off San Diego State, which is very much on the table. So we'll see how that unfolds. But overall, those are the scenarios in the group of five. And it's relatively simple. The ACC gets away from you pretty quickly. The rest of them, I tend to believe, are going to be relatively simple. Maybe we get a Texas A&M loss or an Alabama loss, and Georgia finds their way into the SEC Championship for, I'm just going to say, the millionth time in a row. It feels like they've been there all the time. But at the end of the day, we'll see all of this unfold over this weekend. Just wanted to give everyone a little bit of a cheat sheet, not all the scenarios. It could get very chaotic, and then you could have Duke against SMU, and things could get very weird over there in the ACC in a hurry. But at the end of the day, we'll get to all of that when it does unfold. Just wanted to make sure everyone was as up to speed as you possibly can be on these tiebreaker scenarios as we head into the final week. Let's take our final break here, and then we'll get into all my rivalry week best bets. A lot of really, really good ones. A lot of ones I feel weirdly confident about. So we'll get to it all, and I felt weirdly confident in the past. It hasn't gone all that well, but at the end of the day, we'll get into my best bets right after this, so stick with us.